Hello, everybody, and welcome to our first of the year Curriculum and Policy Committee. Today's Tuesday, 2/22/22, and we are having a consolidated committee of the Curriculum and Policy Committee for this period until summertime, when we have newly elected board members and kind of go back to our separate Curriculum and Policy committees. So just to welcome everyone and introduce us, my name is Aura Russell-Better, and I'm chairing this committee this year, and I'm a District 4 school board member. And we have board member Mickey Bondo, and she's a District 1 school board member. And has been part of the curriculum committee, so that will be great continuity on this committee. And we have board member Nylat Bilyeu, who's at-large member, joining us for this committee. Happily having you here to join us. And then we have our staff member, Assistant Superintendent of School Management. Do I have that right, Aaron? And he's our wonderful staff who's really focusing on the policy committee work that we have ongoing here with PPS. So we don't have to do any minutes today, I think, right? Because this is kind of our new start to this committee for this year. And I think because we're such a small group, I don't think we really need to do the raise your hand feature. You know, when we have a bigger group, we do, but I think we'll be able to just kind of have board members pop in with questions and comments as needed when we go through the agenda today. So I think we're good, Mr. Townsend, to get going and kind of touch on our agenda for tonight.
Great. I do see Ms. Jody in the attendees side. So Jody, if you're comfortable, was thinking, you know, we have had the student members join the committee as panelists. So I'll promote you to panelist, Jody, if you want to join our conversations. So. There we go.
Thank you very much. I hadn't received an invite, so I only came the only way I knew how. So thank you.
Oh, okay, Ms. Dio, thank you for coming. Ms. Dio is one of our student representatives from Portland Adult Education, so we're glad you're here. And I think the superintendent has also joined. Oh, Mr. Watana. Okay, good timing.
Right. All right. So for our agenda tonight, we have two discussion items, are the first two items, one in regards to dress code. So we'll do that in just a moment. And then the second in regards to the harassment and sexual harassment of employees. So the employee kind of facing policy around harassment. So those two are discussion items. And then the last thing for tonight is kind of a more looking at some substantive changes as a potential action item in terms of this committee's review of proposed changes to the reporting child abuse and neglect policy. So those are kind of the three things we'd identified as to kind of set up, as this is obviously our first meeting of the, of this combined policy committee work and kind of new configuration. We had talked about, these first two as discussion items, as we'll talk through, will be to kind of tee up work for the spring. That's why they're just discussion items at this point. But then the last one was kind of cleaning up a bit of work that came out of our work around the law enforcement policies and changes we made to other policies that we wanted to incorporate here. So that's kind of why we have the agenda that we do in front of us for tonight. Any questions about agenda before we kind of jump into the first business item? And is everybody good? I put the link in there, have access to the materials and stuff on the board doc agenda. Yeah, okay, great. Okay, well, let's start the first agenda item as dress code. So this is kind of on our radar because there was some feedback over the course of the fall of interest in looking back at our dress code. So, that came some from the Family Partnership Advisory Committee and questions and some discussion. And I think, in fact, when I went to share some of our law enforcement policy work with them, they actually had more questions about dress code than our proposed law enforcement policy at the time. And, I think as arose questions from a few school communities, from this fall and returning back to school and understanding implications. So I thought what might make sense for us to do today is to first get this group just grounded in what is the language of our current policy. It's one that was updated not that long ago. So it's not like it's as compared to some of our policies that may be further out of date. This one was updated, let's see.
18?
No, yeah, in 2018. Yep, May of 2018. So, but felt like it would be worthwhile to kind of ground here and then talk about the discussion is, just kind of reactions and feedback to the policy areas where we might seek to kind of get input or, might seek to kind of get improvements, and then who we may want to engage in that process. I think this is one that would have value of some level of kind of community engagement and dialogue before we bring forward additional changes. So that's the goal, with this one. So I might invite folks, as needed, to take just a couple minutes to just review the language of the policy again. So we can give you all just a couple minutes to review both the policy as well as the related procedure before we kind of begin our discussion. Does that sound good to everybody? Okay. So let's take...
Could I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I saw it mentioned middle school in one piece, but are they specifically to middle and high, or is there specificity to elementary at all?
So that would be good. There isn't nothing specifically that calls out elementary.
Okay.
So, and again, that shows up in the procedure part of it. So there's the global policy, JICA, student dress code, and then JICR that speaks specifically to high school and middle school. So.
Okay.
Can I offer just a little bit of context and background on this policy? When it changed back in 2018, the most significant adjustment that we made to the policy was the first sentence, because we wanted to establish that it was primarily a parent and child responsibility as opposed to the school board or the school district or school administrators being the arbiters of what it is that a student wears to school. So the idea there was to clearly frame up that, if I don't like what, somebody's child wears to school, my discussion has to be with the parent to find out, are you okay with it? Because if you're okay with it, then I'm okay with it. So that was the most significant. And we did have a significant amount of student engagement around this. There had been, significant controversy the year before with a student at one of our middle schools being, told that what they were wearing was, non-conforming and, distracting and things along those lines. And there had been several instances prior to that. And the previous, and this was before I started, the student reps on the board had convened a group of students to come up with language around this, which is what then went on to form the basis for what is currently in the procedures that we're also going to be looking at.
So, Superintendent, that one sentence was added, and it wasn't out there prior that says the piece about this is the parents. respond? Okay, thank you.
Anything else anybody wants to share or ask before we kind of take a moment to give people a chance to review the policy and procedure? Okay, let's go ahead and just take maybe 3 minutes to kind of scan back through the policy and procedure. Again, this is mainly for discussion at this point, and then we'll kind of come back. Do people need an additional minute or so? That's about 3 minutes, or we're ready to jump in. Okay. Let's start first just with the overarching policy of JICA. So just want to see if there's, we can start with clarifying questions, but then as well, I think what my interest is here is, are there areas of input or feedback we would want to get on any aspect of this policy? We'll get to the procedure, which I think there might be more discussion around, but start with just the overarching policy. Any questions, wonderings, potential areas of improvement or clarification that folks see?
I guess I'm just struck by the line that says, let's see, where did I see this? Be in the third paragraph. Schools may prohibit dress which causes a material and substantial disruption to the learning process. That just, to me, it makes me, what does that mean exactly? I guess I feel like that still potentially could go along with that narrative of, it's the student who's wearing something that may be distracting's responsibility to dress in a way that's not distracting someone versus that it's, that seems that could be a sexual discrimination or a gendered sort. So and maybe that's just my perception of that language, but I guess I'm curious what the material and substantial disruption could be. I don't really know what the material, I guess I'm not clear what the material piece might mean.
I think I can emphasize that question too before you answer, because when we talk about dress here, is about the length of the dress, or I mean, is everything should be more clear here to understand what the regulation will be when we talk about dress here, about material and substantial descriptions. So what we mean, I think we're missing some pieces here to be more clear.
So material and substantial is a term that's used in school law, and so I think that's where that comes from. The Supreme Court held that that school, and on numerous occasions, but probably the first time that I think that term was used was in the context of the armband protests in the 1960s and the case called Tinker versus Des Moines. And in that particular case, the court held that school officials had a right to restrict, dress that was a substantial material disruption. And in that particular case, they found that even though school districts have a right to do that, they cannot, that the armband was not considered a substantial material disruption, and that the students, had a right to wear them as a form of protest. So that's, an example of it. If you look at, our procedure, it lays out specific instances that would be considered substantial material disruption, such as, genitalia being exposed, curse words being worn on a shirt, hate speech being, worn on a hat. Things along those lines are what would be considered a material and substantial disruption. And so there is always going to be an element of, subjectivity that goes with that decision. But that's why it's, it's legal language. And that's why there are lawsuits over that, because if one person thinks that, wearing a MAGA hat is a, form of, of material and substantial disruption, and, somebody challenges that, that's where you wind up in, in litigation. So.
Yeah, that is, so I think we'll get to the procedure here next, but I think that's where we get into the defining, policies generally written to be kind of global, and the procedures help to provide examples or, in different cases, that's where we get kind of more specific details. And we can, we don't need to belabor on this side unless there's, because I do think there's, it's the procedure, it's kind of the details where, this becomes, where it all lives ultimately, right? But Nyla, did you want to share something about this before we move?
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think it's important to be, intentional about language. So what I heard was, folks had said distraction first, but then the legal term that is used is disrupting, right? Or disruption. So maybe indicating that, if that's what we're trying to say, if it's a disruption more than a distraction, because I think disruption holds more importance than a distraction can be seen more as you're just kind of sexually distracting people on the side over there. Whereas when you're disrupting, it's more intentional, or you're kind of showing up to be intentionally disruptive. So I think that indication could be important. I wanted to talk specifically about the gang piece, the gang material piece. I'm wondering go ahead.
No, yeah, just formally move us to the policy. So, so we'll start there, right? Or to the procedure. Sorry again.
Okay.
No, and you're right on. So let's go there. I think the language does say disruption. So, but I think that paragraph is one ultimately we may come back to, because I think that's the key connector between the policy and then the procedure. So again, just, if this hadn't been clear,
sorry. I was looking at two different documents.
No. I think you're right to go to those things. That's, I think, where the more substantive conversation is of like how those things get defined. But anyway, just, those, like when they're coded like JICA, right? Those are all the procedures, and that just spells out how we implement the policy. So that's why like there's so much language and examples, and typically they're longer, right, than the actual policies themselves, because it gives a little bit of, or it frames exactly how we do things. So, but let's go to those questions like you have there now around the procedure. So go ahead. You were talking about the gang piece.
Yeah. I think, I just had a question around that where, I don't know. I mean, I guess this is it could be a very complex conversation. I'm not really sure how prevalent gang violence is in Portland. So I'm wondering if there's even a need for that, or if there's even, because I mean, also gang like material is also, it's like, what's the word? It's like prevalent to the kind of like the atmosphere of being in a gang. So I feel like for us to restrict somebody, I mean, like, I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking about like just the very real experience of like, and if a kid is in a gang, they don't really have much control over like how they dress and how they affiliate in that way. So if they're coming to school and then when we're telling them like, I mean, then we would even have to know you're in a gang and that's a gang symbol or whatever. But I'm wondering if restriction could cause them more harm within their own gang or whatever. I mean, like, I guess start with the question of like, are gangs even in Portland, and is it even relevant to have that language? But also like the safety aspect of like, are we putting them in more harm if we're telling them that they can't like wear gang colors or whatever, because that could offset more issues for them personally.
Yeah. And I think, again, the goal of our conversation is to surface areas for us to dig into potentially. So we don't need to answer. I mean, in my experience, having been a teacher and principal in Deep East Oakland, I would say, no, we don't have a gang issue in Portland. There may be some level of it. I don't want to say that there's none. And I think it'd be a good conversation to have with kids in particular, like with high school youth. So I'd be interested in talking about it. So, but my experience of like sitting, as a principal in a community that bordered a bunch of different turfs, right? We managed actively around colors and those kinds of things. And I think it did present, in that context, it did present immediate safety issues for us at school and for the kids on their way to and from. But, there's only, kids are smart, right? So,
that's what I'm like. I mean, like if we were in a situation like that, we would probably have to take a more proactive role of like trying to create like a safety platform for these kids, where it's like in Portland, there's not really that much. But I guess I wouldn't also say like, let's completely scrap it, because
I think it's a good area of inquiry. Yeah. And
Okay.
Jody?
I just wanted to say, I don't know about in school, but I know that on the streets, there's some type of gang activity in that people are at least trying to, in the back of their pocket, they'll have a red or a blue or a black bandana, so I don't think it's anything as bad as other cities and in inner cities, but it's at least adult wise, there's some. So I just wanted to say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What, as it relates to the procedure, so that's one that I think it'd be really interesting to get youth perspective on, and the potential issues it creates. You're framing there, Nyla, around just, what the experience for kids is. And But are there wonderings or questions that we might have or want to get input on as it relates to the procedure more broadly? And I think this comes back to kind of the question you raised, Mickey, about, Aura and Mickey, I forget who was the first, but about, substantial and material disruption, right? And how that gets defined. Because I don't know if I said before, so I apologize because I meant to. I hold a wondering as we do get some input and feedback and discussion around this policy, if ultimately the issues are with the policy language. So I think we should maintain as a question for us, like, are the issues with the policy language or are the issues around implementation of the policy, like at the school level, right? That the policy, if it was implemented as written, could be fine. I don't know. We should, interrogate that question. But I think we should be open to the possibility that it's about strengthening implementation and consistency or, training around that. And maybe both, right? Also, but I think those two things are possible. Go ahead, Mickey.
Yeah, I have a question here on the appropriate consequences of any dress code violation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what I see here from my side, my opinion missing here are to have more details on those consequences, because he just mentioned here it's going to be an insubordination and will be under discipline as such. That's it. So what really happened here when we have a dress code violation? Like we know, okay, those are the consequences. It's going to be suspension. When it's going to happen, it's going to be the first warning. Or what happened? So those I see when I was reading is that it just mentioned that it's going to be consequences, but nothing. When you can see is not the opposite side. I mean, they cannot kick out of school or get the grade, lowering the grade, but that's it. But anything else, then those consequences can be more relevant here.
Yeah. That's. I think that's an area to kind of clean up, consistent with some of the discipline policy revisions we passed. This predates all that, so I think there's some useful potential alignment there. That's a good call out.
I think a good area to get input would be the vagueness of some of these policies. Like, I wonder if ask or try to have a focus group around, like, if the students feel like these policies are vague or if they're kind of around, or if they're more diligent, I guess. Because some language is vague. So I'm wondering if that's offering space for more, like more leeway or leniency, or if it's just saying that because of the language. Can you share one example of what's generating that wondering for you? I guess, like around kind of what Mickey said about the consequences.
Sure. Okay. Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I mean, like, also, like, I mean, I'm assuming like teachers aren't going to judge, but like, what about like non-conforming, like attire? Like if a male presenting person wants to wear a dress, like how does that kind of, like, maybe that language should also be there for like LGBTQ students that want to be more expressive with their
Minimally, it seems like we should have a reference to the gender expansive policy, right?
Yeah.
The all places where we should reference that and potentially the student discipline stuff as well to try and tie things together.
Yeah, maybe Barrett could also help with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I had a question for you, Javier. That's a thank. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jody.
No, I just had a question about like length of, I didn't see anything, maybe I just didn't see it, about like length of skirts. Like it says in the past, have you guys just had any discussions of that?
I believe substantial. Javier, why don't you?
Yes. Fortunately, that was probably several iterations ago where we've evolved past the, like they have to be at, at this length or that length. But, and I don't know, I'm sorry, I had to step out to take a call, but I don't know if you've discussed this, but, I think there's a lot more around implementation, operationalization, sort of the actual on the ground use of the policy than there is around the policy itself. So to that point, even though we don't have anything around that, it is not, I would not say it's unheard of that, a parent will, come to us and say, my kid was told that their skirt was too short. So it does happen, but there's nothing, in the policy that references the length of a skirt. And it's sort of, I think that the challenge with these things is always like, do you have every possible scenario that you think is, likely to happen? Because if that's in there, then somebody will want to find a way to push beyond that, or just sort of go with general examples and then, sort of exception manage when something happens. I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
Did you want to finish something, or I had a couple thoughts, but did you want to ask?
Well, I was just curious from the historical, when this version of the procedure was adopted, about what the rationale was around the distinctions between middle school and high school and why nothing was spoken to around elementary. I know we've had some other procedures like the tobacco and vaping very different, but had different sets of procedures for middle school, high school, and elementary that we've kind of cleaned up. So I'm wondering.
Yeah, I actually don't remember why we felt compelled to separate the middle school and the high school one. I would, I don't see a compelling reason why there would need to be, a distinction between high schools and middle schools, or, for that matter, leave elementary school students out of there. I think it still holds true that everything that we say in, in the high school dress code would carry over to elementary school students.
Like one specific difference, and this may be the place for some discussion, is like, the explicitness around number 2 in the high school is not there, but the chest and midriffs are to be predominantly covered at high school and must be covered at middle school. Again, we don't need to determine that, but that stands out as a distinction that I'm curious about.
When Javier was talking, something was coming to my mind when I look at the middle school, and I think, I see that everything starts at the middle school, because sometimes when we don't have, it's just that transition when students are moving from the middle school to high school. So when we have different ways on the dress code, so that transition sometimes is so difficult to be adjusted. So if we can have one standard, from middle school to high school, I'm sorry, that's my home phone. But when we can have something standard, really have the same language moving from the middle school to the high school, just include it to one policy. So students know then from the middle school, that's a continuation, the same dress code to the high school, instead to have a different aspect. So the thing is, they're really meaning almost the same thing, but the way the languages are written here and some of the narrative is look like we have a different procedure for the middle school, and also a different one for the high school.
Yeah. And that actually does remind me, and I don't remember why we settled where we settled, but there was a significant discussion around the covering of the midriff and undergarments that was different from the middle school leaders' perspective than it was for the for high schools.
I'm also wondering, I noticed that, with what you called out on the policy, like the first sentence of the policy here in the procedure under middle school, it says, that's the first sentence again, rests with parents and guardian, and doesn't say, it applies to high school, right? Because it's in the broader policy, but isn't reiterated in the same way at the high school one, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, in reading this now, 4 years removed, I am, I'm surprised at how inconsistent they are. And, I know that the high school one was specifically the one that the student reps had worked through, and we tried to honor that. And, it even, just sort of the directness of the language and everything else is, a result of that. But I don't remember if we felt uncomfortable, if it was a significant sort of stretch for the middle school staff. I do remember like this last paragraph that is, basically you can ask kids to dress differently for for like a concert. You can require them to wear a specific set of, clothes. You need to let them know in advance. You need to facilitate it for those who might not have access to it, and things along those lines was a big part of the conversation. I think that holds true at the high school as well. And, that should be included across the board as, a specification. But I am looking at the clothing needs to cover the midriff and undergarments at the middle school and saying, like, I can't believe that actually is in there.
So I think we've, established that that's an area for kind of question and input about whether, these should be aligned, right? Potentially, and is there a substantive difference across grade span that merits some distinction? I think it could be presented in a way that isn't so stark as like, this is the high school one, this is the middle school one, if that was the case. But so I think that's an area of kind of inquiry and input that we'd want to gather.
Could I offer a couple of thoughts? I just bigger picture, I just keep going back to what is the purpose of a dress code? Right. And I think if we have that line of parents are really the ones in charge of making the decisions about what's appropriate or not, I think we just have to really keep thinking about how historically use of dress codes really has been used to promote race and sex discrimination. Right. So that's, the message that students' cultural background has to be left at home and not brought into the school because of whatever, more white-based cultural expectations about succeeding in school. So I think being really clear about that, I feel like it gets really, if we're talking about length of skirt, or then it could be how tight someone's clothes are. I mean, I just feel like if we don't get clear about that, and I know there's always going to be subjectivity, like the superintendent said, we can't list every single possible thing, but on the other hand, it makes me think about grooming and like, do we need to have that explicitly laid out? And I don't know in Portland schools, I'm sure there have been cases, but we know across the country cases with students wearing braids or afro, like really being disciplined that for very specific cultural reasons that they are presenting at school, that I think we have to be explicit in some way that is not a place where in school we get to say what is appropriate for learning in school. So I don't know if that came up in those prior years, but I just feel like, to me, the grooming can also be like piercing jewelry, like those are pieces too. So I don't know if those have come up, but that could certainly, I'm sure that those have come up, that there have been staff that have said something's not appropriate, and I don't know how much that should be laid out, but just that's where my mind goes, and just thinking culturally what I see stories of across the country about issues with dress in school. So
yeah, I definitely echo that. And I think with with Portland Public Schools, or like my biggest worry or something that I've experienced is like kind of like the view of cultural attire sometimes. Like I've seen students like just be really foul to other students that are like representing their cultural attire or that are wearing their cultural stuff. So I'm wondering if there's language about how to be more inclusive around that, like, because then that could welcome people to be more understanding or to understand more about other people's attire. Like, I'm wondering if like we can have, I don't know, maybe I feel like I'm digging a hole there, but I think it's important to try to find a way to address what Aura said in terms of like, how can we be more inclusive so that kids don't feel like they can't represent themselves. But I also think that could be a rabbit hole of like, you know, how do we make sure every single little thing is okay? So I think that, yeah, that could be a little bit difficult. But I just wanted to echo what you were saying.
Yeah. But I wonder if there is a way to just, you know, lead with positivity about different forms of presenting that are, you know, sort of, you know, an expression of, you know, who you are, and, you know, that there may be a way to do that. And
sorry, Aaron, or even like that there would be consequences for like, you know, making fun of somebody for their cultural attire, or like, you know, just kind of like being, because I know that could happen. Like if a Muslim girl was wearing her hijab and she, you know, got made fun of for wearing her hijab, like, I'm wondering if we can also maybe specify that language too. Like we want to be inclusive. We welcome, you know, cultural attire or whatever you prefer, but we will also take accountability for those students that are like harming or that are, I don't know if that language is already.
That is in the harassment and discrimination policy, the student to student, as well as in the bullying policy. You know, so maybe there's, you know, and I don't recall if we have a reference to those policies in here. So I think that, you know, definitely to cross-reference with those policies makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's another good, you know, couple cross references to add. And again, you know, you know, as we look at it, I mean, there aren't any on the dress code currently. So I think we've identified already 4 that would be good to include, you know, the gender expansive, harassment, discrimination, bullying, and student discipline. But I was also thinking, yeah, part of this conversation was around, you know, one of our approaches recently to the revision of the policies, not so much the procedures, right, but the policy, because that's the overarching kind of like vision philosophy document a little bit, right, is to have like a purpose, essentially a purpose statement at the beginning. So I think, Aura, your comment there, you know, this kind of just gets right into it, right? You know, and I think should incorporate that language there around like it's, you know, that's a matter for the parent and the student, right? But I think some of the elements of what we're talking about would be incorporated in there in terms of the vision of like, why do we have it, right? What are we seeking to promote by having a dress code policy? And, you know, some acknowledgement of kind of respectful interaction around students' choices, or I don't know. So we can work on that, but I could see that as an area of improvement for this.
I love the purpose statement. That's great.
Yeah. So I'm mindful of time a little bit, you know, with our 2 other agenda items. So I think we have a number of kind of substantive areas for feedback and input. What I would propose as initial engagement moves is to you know, to engage with the Family Partnership Advisory Committee. They're always a strong, reliable, you know, kind of group. And certainly it came from, you know, that was one of the groups that raised questions. So I feel a kind of responsibility, accountability to have some discussion with them around some of these items. We have launched the Student Advisory Committee that's represented by high school students. So I think we need to think a little bit about how to get some middle school student input as well. But That's another existing structure that I'd propose, we bring this policy to for feedback and input, and potentially loop in the student board members, in some of that. So, I'm thinking about leveraging, for engagement around this, just in part because what we'll talk about with the next policy, leveraging some existing structures to be able to get student and family input on these issues. So that's what I'd propose in terms of next steps. So I can take responsibility for managing that over. That probably means, potentially coming back to this in April, just to have enough time since we're already into March, potentially on the March agenda items, for both Family Partnership Advisory and the Student Advisory.
So sorry, Mr. Townsend, just to clarify, would that be sort of like a focus group setup? Is that what you imagine? Or would it be
I wouldn't call it a focus group
formal?
specifically,
Yeah.
but those are, agenda items of more, of kind of a discussion with, I think I'd frame a few prompts for discussion based on the things we talked about.
And so there would be like a separate family advisory. Oh, sorry.
No, sorry, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, so it would be like one with the family advisory, and then the student. There'd be just kind of different opportunities.
Right. Yeah, they're existing, trying to get on their agendas for their existing meetings.
For their meetings. Thank you.
Yeah.
How do you choose the focus groups? Do you just?
Well, again, in this case, what I'm proposing is that these are leveraging some existing structures.
Oh, they already have. Okay, yeah, they already have these advisory boards. Okay.
Right.
Is there any way you could email us of how that process, just kind of the tangible outcomes, what your plan for getting an outcome is?
Sure. Yep. As I frame up that agenda, I'll first put on the agenda and then absolutely can kind of share and who those folks are. And that can be an initial step, I think, just out of the range of things, because I think, for this next one, I do want to propose establishing a work group around the staff harassment one. So it's a little bit of kind of allocation of time and bandwidth, that we do have these two existing structures that are good. If we feel like from there we need to do more engagement and input, that's certainly on the table, right? That I'm not saying that has to be the end all be all, but it feels like those are two good structures to begin with, in terms of just managing it all. But I'll share the agenda and the prompts kind of based on this, and can share who the membership is and all that. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I think with that, let's move to the next business item, the discussion around the staff harassment policy. So the kind of setup for that is, we went through, a long deliberative process around our student harassment policy. So, and we established a separate work group that was, connected with a lot of community-based advocacy groups, primarily from the sexual assault and violence community, and, resulted in the policy that we have, right, that we approved, just over a year ago, and has already, shown some, I would say, significant impact just in terms of the numbers of reports and things we've been able to address explicitly that maybe we wouldn't have previously. So we always knew there was always kind of a question that came out of that, because there is a separate policy that speaks to staff harassment. So there was always a following question of, well, what about staff, right? Appropriately so. That was only kind of further deepened through our research work and partnership with Dora Santoro from Bowdoin and a couple of our internal staff in the Educators of Color report that they, conducted and reported, and, so it just highlighted the need there as well of revisiting the staff policy in the same way and kind of giving it, for lack of a better phrase, kind of the same treatment and interrogation of, what we really want to have as a policy for staff to protect staff's rights around harassment and discrimination. So, so what we propose here is establishing a work group of, staff. We have, identified some potential central office staff to help kind of coordinate and kind of convene the group. So that includes our affirmative action officer from HR, who's Richard Moore, but also Julia Hazel, who's our director of BIPOC Pathways, Barrett, through his role as diversity, equity, inclusion, and then Kate Brogan as our ombuds person. So those feel like kind of the right central office folks. And then we'd look to recruit a diverse group of staff from across various roles within the district to be part of a work group there to kind of go deep on this policy and recommend to the policy committee proposed changes to the existing staff harassment policy. So our goal would be to kind of like launch that now to be able to bring forward proposed changes potentially by May to this group so that we could review and vet those with the goal of either bringing them forward to the full board in June or August so that a revised policy would be in place for the next school year to support, staff. So that's kind of the setup, but I wanted to give folks a chance to kind of just look at the policy again as well for a minute to just be grounded in it and what the current language is and ask any questions or any things that, kind of prompts, if you will, same as we talked about the dress code one, for this work group. So let me see if that just kind of are there any questions about that setup or context before we look at the policy?
I'm really in favor on that concept. I think that's just the best pathway to go to it because it's more inclusive, and then you have input from different aspects of our staff and educators. And
Great.
I had just a few questions when I compare with what we have established for the student. Are we thinking to do the same pathway like we building on the budget also, like those kind of, if we had some feedback from the team you just described, are we doing some different step on the implementations like we have done some, if we approve some of those change, then it may occur. So are we thinking to do those implementation, those step of implementation like we have done with the students?
Well, I guess some of it remains to be seen. We need to kind of see where we get. I think likely there's some potential. I don't know, necessarily that it's the same resource investment, at least in terms of like positions or FTE, right? We do have folks, the like roles attached to this. So this may be helping to kind of clarify and just reground, some of the work that we should be doing. But I think that's a question we'll need to hold as we, look through proposed revisions of what are the resources needed to adequately implement it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that makes sense because when I look at especially the space for recovery and so everything, then staff is still a human being, everything they're going through, some of those discrimination and harassment is that, are we building those secure platforms for them to feel, okay, they really can be heard and the complaint can move forward. Just a platform, then we've been giving voice to students, to come forward and to feel like, they really have that kind of surrounding support for them while they're coming forward for any kind of complaint. So I think it's going to be the same thing because when going back and I remember what I read to the educator of color, it's just those surviving that they've been facing for years. I mean, they feel like, okay, even though I'm going to make any complaint, something will change. So that means, they already have that mindset for years because of the system. So if we want to make some change, we really need to paying attention. Okay, are we going to build those zone of secure and emotional setting where people can come forward and knowing, okay, my voice can be heard, and I know it's going to be some step forward. Then I can, then I can have some results. Yeah, I just want to bring up, those kind of views. can pay attention when time comes, you know.
Yep.
Aaron, I have another question, and great
Yep.
points, Ms. Bondo. Were you seeing a role for any local organizations to be part of, like, because there were with the student harassment discrimination, right? So I just wondered, in this case, would that be, do you see a need for that?
I think I think potentially we have discussed like SARSM. SARSM provides services to a variety of, it isn't exclusively a youth focused institution. Some of the groups that we did have that were part of the student work group are explicitly youth focused, groups like Through These Doors was the dating, is focused on dating violence. Speak Up is a consent education, focused again on youth and school curricula. Boys to Men, again, is kind of like a middle school, high school, PD, professional development thing. So I think we're open to it, not ruling it out, but of that constellation of partners. And we had done work subsequently to engage ACLU and others. They don't have the same, those were all, as well, kind of sexual violence and assault organizations, right? That was an advocacy group kind of coming out of, all the Title IX stuff, which was awesome. They were fabulous. We were always cognizant and had worked to try and identify who else from kind of a racial harassment and discrimination partner might be effective partners. And that was where engaging with some of those, but there isn't the same, so open to that if there's a relevant organization that would.
So maybe just some troubleshooting about that. I'm just remembering Ms. Billio bringing this up. So at a board meeting, I hope you don't mind me just mentioning that, Ms. Billio.
Yeah, I was actually
this is the context, right? It's saying we want input from the communities that are affected. So yeah, if you want to.
Yeah, and I think it's important to not always specify that an organization is the way to go, because we know that Black people don't have organizations, Black people don't have access to organizations. They can't just, poof and be like, all right, I'm going to take my time to do anti-racism work and make that be the organization and the work. So I'm wondering, and I'm willing to be a resource in this because I do this for work, but I'm wondering, how are we engaging with just specific organizers or specific community members that we have an idea of? I know Sama Abdullahi, she's a poet, and she also works for, or she used to work for the Maine domestic violence survivor hotline or whatever. So I'm wondering if maybe I can work with Julia on this to just create a list of specific community leaders that we can always tap in, obviously with compensation and stuff like that. But I think we need to create something like that because we're always missing that input and that community engagement. And there's no way we're going to find it if we're going to organizations that are a lot of times white-led and predominantly white. So I'm wondering if we can create resources of community leaders, because it's not like these community leaders are going to be like, Portland Public Schools wants me to work. No, I'm not going to do it. I'm not, you know what I mean? So if we create engagement and we have capacity building to empower them in this work, they would happily be willing to step up and happily be willing to, especially if it's in hopes of creating safer spaces for students of color. And that was actually one of the things I wanted to discuss is this doesn't really address some of the vast intersections that Black people experience, like anti-Blackness, colorism, misogynoir. Those are very deep isms that are more intersectional than just people of color are experiencing this. Misogynoir is specific racism that Black women experience specifically from both Black men and patriarchal systems. So understanding that that is specific to Black women, or colorism is specific to dark-skinned Black people. And like trying to understand the specific isms that impact those people, and like getting folks that can explain more on what those are and can contextualize those, I think it's going to be important, because we don't want to just bunch everybody up and be like, harassment for race is what we're looking at. But if it goes deeper than that, we want to be able to have that language. Like if it's colorism and we don't have the capacity to understand what that is, and that's the harassment that's going on, we wouldn't be equipped to deal with that, and a student wouldn't have the capacity to come to us with that issue. And I mean, I've dealt with it. It was my whole experience at Pullman Public Schools. So it's like, how do we kind of contextualize some of those deeper issues? And it would be a good, and this would be a good opportunity to kind of go to those community leaders, or collect a list of those community leaders that we can utilize as resources to give us more information on some of these things.
Yep, that sounds great. In terms of having, identifying those folks. And yeah, I think there potentially is kind of a role with Julia and with that team, who's going to kind of be coordinating to help identify and bring them in. Again, just kind of clarifying at this point, this one is focused on like staff experience, right? How the adults are experiencing it. So all those things may apply as well, right? So like having some depth of understanding there would benefit. I could see how that would benefit the group. So
yeah, and I think, and some of those things that I was explaining actually might be more prevalent in adults than students because of like the severity of them. And people's capacity of understanding them. But yeah.
Yep.
And if I can just emphasize a little bit what Naya just mentioned, I think what she just mentioned, I think is going to be more appropriate to have that one as a resource backup. Once some cases coming to that stage, so the specific staff has enough support. So what really missing, like I just said earlier, is that educators of color, they just don't have those kind of understanding and support around those issues when it comes in front of them. They have been isolated without knowing exactly where they have to lay to. They don't have any capacity building around that. So to be more inclusive, so those resources that she just described will be really relevant to have them close by and be available when we need it. So we have to pay attention, because this is occurring all the time, but it's been already heartbroken to see that we lost a lot of educators of color because of those lack of support around those kind of issues she just described. So I think building capacity around those community leaders who really have a lot of input about colorism and all those issues related to the person of color, I think for Julia is going to be a great asset.
Yeah. Yep. I think what's resonating for me is both building. I think it's on, kind of all sides of that issue, right? We use the frame about recognizing, right, and responding. And so, appreciate how it can benefit us to help build our capacity to recognize the various forms, that harassment and discrimination could play. And then, Mickey, to your point, how we might respond and the supports and, that we can be able to provide folks both individually, right, redress it as kind of like systemically how we're trying to build capacity so that people don't have those experiences in our system. But yeah, so no, that sounds great. So if you want to start, over the course of this week, I'm going to kind of be kicking things off with that group, and I'll indicate them to either reach out to you, Nyla, or connect you with them. So, and for others, if there are other folks. So that sounds great. Okay, if we can, so that was just kind of wanted to tee up that body of work, for us to kind of come forward, and we'll, as we did with the other one, it's not an expectation that, policy committee members are participating in that, but we'll make you aware of when those work group meetings are happening and those kinds of things so that you're at least aware, and if you're interested, can join those. So, okay, if we could go to our last business item of the evening here with our last 20 minutes. So this one is a little bit of a different. So the goal is potentially, if you're, depending on how it goes, but, approving proposed changes for for this policy to then, or it's really to recommend to the board, these proposed changes to the policy. And again, at the board level, we go through 2 reads of policy changes. So the first read, usually, if it's just this one-off, we'll see, we may not do a separate explicit workshop around just one policy, but the superintendent and the chair will figure that out for us. And then we do a second read when they get approved formally. So this one is in front of us again because in the course of making some of the revisions during our work around the law enforcement related policies, we made some substantive changes to the visitor policy, which had a section about visits by both law enforcement officials as well as Department of Health and Human Services officials. And so when we went through that, we decided to eliminate that section from the visitor policy because it didn't feel like it was, people didn't know to go there. It didn't necessarily make sense for that language to live there. And so that was part of why we established, or, we incorporated the law enforcement piece with the new policy we established there. And it was our intention to then incorporate the language about the visits by Department of Health and Human Services in the overall child abuse and neglect policy. So that's what I've attempted to do here. Additionally, there were a few small changes that I don't know if people will perceive them as small or not, are important changes that came out of the recent legislative session. So this is kind of current, if you will. So I used our model policy, or our existing policy, the Drummond Woodsum model policy based on the recent legislation and the language from the visitor policy to kind of have these proposed changes. So again, knowing this is kind of our first time working through this, if people have it open, the version that would be helpful for us to kind of look through that has the most substantive is the one that says draft with today's date. So that's the lots of 2s, 02, 22, 22 version, because that will have, and typically as we do this, we go through kind of red line proposed changes so that it's ideally clear. It gets a little bit mishmashy, but ideally it's clear then what language we're proposing. So are people good with the policy in front of them? I'm thinking I'll speak to kind of the sections, like the proposed changes, and then we can see if there's any questions about the proposed new language or, suggestions for revision to it. But go ahead.
Is the red the proposed? Sorry.
Yeah.
Contextual.
Yeah. And then the strike through is like the old language, but the red is the new language, yes. Kind of the replacement language, if you will.
Okay.
Mine has blue. Would that be the same?
Probably.
Yeah.
If it's the same document, sometimes it does get a little funky.
It's the first one?
Yeah, it's the first one, yep.
Yeah, mine is all blue.
Mine has some red and blue. So anyway, track changes is a... So this first one, the definition section is just driven by some updates to the legislative change. So we had most of this in like 1 or 2 paragraphs we added. So this kind of just clarifies the 3 different criteria of how child abuse or neglect is defined. So the first one is kind of reduced to just be that threat to a child's health or welfare. And as that sentence kind of continues, so that includes most of what had previously been there. And then it establishes a second section that speaks specifically to truancy, including related to the new, the recent change to the compulsory school attendance age. So in 2019, it was updated that truancy applied. If a student starts school in kindergarten, then truancy applies. So that's included there. And then number 3, a threat to a child's health or welfare caused by child sex trafficking, that's new language. So that comes out of the new recent legislation. So that had not previously been in our policy. So those are the kind of statutory definitions of child abuse or neglect. So those substantive changes and I think a little bit of formatting. So it's like 3 distinct paragraphs that.
So, Aaron, sir, could you clarify, that was a legislative change, the piece that says that truancy must result in making a child abuse report?
Or it can, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow, so we don't have any say over that if that's the...
It's part of the compulsory attendance. I mean, in practice, we rarely, but statutorily we have the right to, but practice.
So does everybody feel clear? Maybe I need to look at it closer, but I thought that was saying that was the expected procedure. So you're saying that isn't, okay, so that's not in practice. I didn't believe that was happening in practice, but I thought that was a change in legislation. Okay.
In my version, that's deleted.
Okay. Let me look at mine again.
Well, but then does your version have the number 2?
Yes,
I.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
So that's just a bit of the formatting change. I don't think substantively it's that different, but we had kind of these 2 wonky paragraphs. If you look at the existing current one, that I think, not that this is the best presentation, the final version will be cleaned up, but it just puts all the truancy information in its own separate subsection.
So the red, superintendent, is that's being removed?
There's 2 reds. There's red in my version.
Yeah.
I don't have any red.
Yours is in red.
I mean, maybe let me see.
I have read.
And
I just want to know if that's in there,
Can you
Aaron.
just share your screen?
Yeah, there we go. Let's all look at this.
So this is the new language, right? And then this crossed out language was what had been there previously. So you can see much of that language is repeated, but then it started to talk about the absences, and the truancy issues.
Mm-hmm.
So here, this proposed language, has been inserted, and then this proposed new language has been inserted.
Okay.
So to clarify what Aura said, the truancy, like statutory or whatever, is not, we don't have to, or were you saying it's a choice? Like it's, if we want to take that route, then we can. It's more of like we have the option, but it's not always the deliberate route to go.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
And just to remind you, this is the definitions of what is child abuse or neglect. And this is not, and it's, as defined by Maine law.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So they're defining it as like, if somebody's not sending defining one form of child abuse or neglect as not having your kid attend school regularly, right? That doesn't necessarily implicate what we do to try and make that happen, right? But just defining that as one manifestation of child abuse and neglect.
So I have a question on the equivalent of seven full days of inexcuses.
Mm-hmm.
So it's either way, or we have the 7 full days of inexcused absences or 5 consecutive school days. So either way, then it been considered to be truancy.
Yes. Yep. That's the state truancy.
So those are, when do we have anything on around other district, you just have the same? So do we have something that we can compare? They all would say the same thing. Those are the same equivalent timing. I mean, those days is all across different districts as well.
Yes. Yep.
Can you just
And we have to
clarify-
do state reporting. The state monitors that, and we do reporting around truancy based on those definitions.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And these are their
clarify-
words, right? Sorry.
go ahead.
This is the state's language, right? Not ours.
Correct.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Can you just clarify for me, unexcused? I mean, I should know this, but is it excused if a parent says we went somewhere? I mean, is excused anything where a parent gives a reason, or does it have to be?
I mean, again,
list of reasons that they're out.
so, and we can come back to this. I mean, so there, and I can send a link now that I'm sharing them all.
You don't have to go into it all.
I think I can't remember if it's the compulsory school attendance or the truancy policies that exist in Book J spell out. There are some statutorily defined reasons that do count as excused absences. Some of them are fairly broad. And we, during the pandemic as well, we, decided that like lack of access to technology, right, we would consider as excused, in some of our remote situations and things like that. So there have been some instances where we've extended beyond the statutory definition, but there are some statutory definitions that we have in one of the attendance policies. So let me just kind of keep going down here a little bit. There was the only addition to the employee's duty to report, which again, we make, that everybody has a responsibility to report, is the addition of the electronic reporting of suspected through the DHHS portal. I have not had actually experience. We typically still call all these in, to the hotline is, I think, the primary practice, but figured, we should add that just as an option of reporting. So that's the only addition there. And again, that comes out of the model policy based on the legislative changes. So, now here, this is the place where I attempted to integrate language from the visitor policy. So in this big, long comment, that was what existed in our former policy KI, visitors to schools. So I've added a couple of pieces from there. So one, speaking to, visits by, this first piece, agents shall provide written consent prior to interviewing or questioning during regular school hours, except as provided as below. Because again, I think a reminder, sometimes child abuse and neglect is, by the person who cares for them, their parent or whoever that may be. Other times, and often, a number of the instances we've dealt with, it's not, and there are other parties involved. So, but just asserting that. And then I integrated what's down here in section F. Excuse me. So I'll give you a moment.
This is what's being brought over from the policy that we took this out of the visitors to the school policy and brought it over here.
Yep. So yeah, I haven't changed the language in this at all, just inserted it from the prior policy.
I have a question here for the F. I think there's a F, right?
Yep.
So if I understood is that the DHHS, they have a right to interview students in our ground, in our school ground, without any permission from the parents or the
only if they state in writing that they have a reasonable grounds to believe that they need to do that, because if they did it in the home, it would
Right.
increase the chances of harm being done to the child.
I see on the F1 here, but the line then, the prior notice to the parent's legal guardian will increase the threat of serious harm to the child or another person, or the child has contacted the department or person providing service, has put the child into contact. So the language here, then the child has contacted the department or person, the child. So what's the range of ages here then we've been talking about on that specific?
It's independent of any ages, but this is generally, that somebody has made a report. They're concerned that the child is being trafficked or something along those lines. And, it's not something that they want to do in the home because it could potentially cause harm for the child. And so that's the rationale behind it. Or the child themselves have, let the department, told a social worker or something along those lines, mm-hmm. that, something is happening to them at home, and therefore, the social worker says contact, DHS or something along those lines.
Wow. Those are the legal aspects. This is really getting a lot of family in trouble because the language written here is really is not culturally appropriate. So this is, I'm still confused, but this is the legal language here. Then really struggle me on the.
So, Aaron, do you think we could have some, I don't know if back and forth between, it doesn't look like we're going to be ready to move this forward.
That's fine.
Tonight, right? Mickey, what would be helpful with this specifically? Like if there's anything we can ask for the next meeting to have more clarity, or a recommendation you have about this piece?
Yes, because this, I mean, if that, this is, I think we just need more clarification here. So if we understand that, I think families, we understand, because we've been a lot of cases, then family, they were never being advised for anything, because culturally appropriate, we have to learn those process. And I think when the school just have a policy adopted like that, family being all the time be affected by those policies without knowing in advance that this is exactly what's going to happen. So, I mean, this is a lot of education pieces here. And I think we just need to have, I just need to have more details and clarity here. Why the DHHS need, if they really feel like we need to have the different specific on the age, what's those different steps, what's the reason, the child. And I think I think I'm gonna write what my concerns are because of the time frame here. So I can send it to you, Aaron, so you can see why I'm going to here. So my head is still confusing with the language on F here. Then, the DHHS has a lot of authority on families, and a lot of parents been affected because the DHHS has been taking away the children without even going through the process by including the families in that conversation.
Okay.
Because it's about competency, then we really need to make sure that we can build those platforms, because we're giving a lot of power to the DHHS when we need to make sure that we don't want to separate the child, because it's also separating the child to their families without knowing, really, without having that conversation with the families, really hurting also the child development and academic accomplishment on the road. And it's just breaking the families apart. So, yeah.
I guess, so, I mean, I guess like, I'm a little bit confused too. So this language is this the school district's language, or is this what DHS has to do when this happens? So like if child reports or like, yeah. Go.
This specific section, it is existing language for us. It was in the visitor policy. I would need to check. I don't know if whether this is some state mandated portion of the policy, because again, much of what had been here is reflective of kind of overall expectations as it reports, but this was our attempt in, as we've framed, of eliminating it, integrating it into what had been in the visitor policy. So I'd need to confirm whether this specific, my guess is some of this language, like the second one, and this can be a clarification, carry out their duties, what specifically is meant there,
Yeah, I guess I'm more asking just kind of like the difference with some of the stuff that we saw before of like, some of it is law and then some of it is what we can kind of control. But I guess it's also important to talk about, like, does the school district have power to restrict DHS from whatever they want to do? Because I think if we do have that power, then we can be more specific about like how we want them to proceed. But if we don't have that power and DHS has the legal paperwork to just come take a kid, I don't know how impactful we can be in changing language to be more suitable. I guess like those were kind of just where I was thinking of like, what is our power versus what is DHS's power when it comes to like situations like this? And can we actually restrict them and say, no, you have to go a different route to accessing this child, and you can't go through Portland Public Schools. So I'm wondering if that makes sense. If you can.
Yep. And I think I would narrow it because I think that G speaks to like removal of kids, and it does say they need to have legal authority, right? So I think it is more narrowly a question about, do they have the authority, under what authority, or in what, to interview a student without parent consent during the school day on school premises, right? Yeah. And if they do, then that kind of, we don't have much, but if they don't, right, then under what conditions would we think that's appropriate? And we made some adjustments, to the law enforcement piece, to that end. That was kind of the lens through which we did that there. Under what conditions would we think that would be appropriate, right?
So Aaron, are you clear about the answer to that, or would that be to look into and get back to us?
I'll clarify the answer. I'm, curious about this second piece too. So
I think I heard what you were saying, as in like this, that could potentially be where we could fill in the cultural competency aspect, because it seems like that is the only space we have leniency, because you said like if they have more power, we don't really have space to kind of indicate like what they need to do, if I'm getting that right. But if we can figure out like who has more authority, then we can kind of put in that cultural filter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll confirm the scope of our authority and how much discretion we have, and then that can guide, what adjustments we might make to the policy.
Okay. And Aaron, do you think this should be a priority for our next meeting to get to this? To be able to bring it? Is that a priority, or?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be great to kind of move this along. I mean, so, just because it feels like something from, the fall, but, as we work through on the agenda, yeah, we'll see what otherwise, curriculum wise, we're going to propose, but for agenda. Okay, well, I'll clarify those pieces, and then Mickey, if you want to share some of those thoughts more specifically to help, inform how to tee up the conversation when we come back to kind of make it as efficient as possible. So, great.
All right, so it looks like we should get a motion to adjourn for the evening.
A second.
All right. I just want to thank everybody for just some great discussion and digging into these policies. I'm excited to keep working together. And I just wanted to flag our next meeting, March 22nd, 4:30. So thanks everybody so much. We're adjourned at 6:05. Have a great evening, the rest of the school vacation week, everybody.